Today, I am mainly going to talk about China, though I want to say a few things either at the end of the hour or at the beginning of the discussion period about the Middle East. And I also want to answer a question that somebody asked me. Where do I get off talking about China and world affairs? After all, I'm not a China specialist. And there are people who spend their lifetimes studying China or Nigeria or Russia or whatever the country is. Folks in my line of business aren't country specialists. We look at policy, that is to say, the foreign policy of countries and the role of those countries in international affairs. And yes, we often read about those countries enough to try to understand what brings about those policies, but that comes secondhand. That is to say, we read what the experts have to say rather than ourselves becoming experts, right? So I don't speak Chinese, I don't read Chinese, I don't follow day-to-day domestic politics of China. I just look at China in terms of its role in the world. So there's a difference between those of us who look at international affairs versus country specialists. I just want to clarify. We don't claim to know everything by any stretch of the imagination. China. There has never been a country in recorded history who has managed to move as many people from abject poverty to almost a middle-class society. It's a historic first, really. And you can look at, I could rail off statistics about this sort of thing. But for example, the Chinese life expectancy nowadays is 76 years. American life expectancy is 78 years. Every other industrial country's life expectancy is around 82 years. So we're actually closer to China than we are to other industrial countries. Now you may say, and I don't want to belabor this point, why would this be so? Well, all kinds of things. Lack of health care, diabetes, all kinds of overweight, obesity of various kinds, and so forth, so that we have a much higher rate of infant mortality, not to mention other disabling characteristics. So China, it's not that China doesn't have poor people, it's the fact that it's made remarkable progress and that a very large proportion of the Chinese now perceive themselves as being sort of middle class and leading middle class lives. Now, we've talked about this before. For late developing societies, they can often skip over things, right? Instead of having to let's say, build a national telephone system, you can instantly move to cell phones and so forth. So for the late developing societies, they're not developing in the same order that the earlier developing societies, industrial societies, have developed. The other thing to say by way of prologue is that countries and the role they play in the world is very different over time. That is to say, if you think about it historically, small countries like England, Portugal, Spain, Holland played a major role in world affairs. Why? Because they had the ingredients for being able to be world actors. They were near oceans, shipping developed, they were able to, roam around the seas, both for commerce and colonizing places and so forth. Right? They were tiny little countries. They weren't huge countries. So the idea that you can only make a major impact in the world and play a major role in the world, you have to be a big country, is not the case at all. And let me give you a counter-contemporary example, which is as big a role as China is playing in the world right now, India is playing a very small role. India is as large as China. It will probably have a slightly larger population within the next 20 years than China does, because its birth rate is so much higher than the Chinese is currently. It has India is an important country in many ways, and the relationship between India and Pakistan and the Kashmir stuff is, serious business, but it is in the neighborhood. In fact, if one wanted to look at the size and scope of the diplomatic corps of a country, that is to say, how much of a role they're intending to play and capable of playing, India has a remarkably small foreign service with very few diplomats, actually, and no intentions at all, or no capacity at all, even if the intentions existed, for roaming around. So one can't just say, well, the reason China is now so important in the world is because it's so big. That's total nonsense, either historically or even in the contemporary sense. The other thing to say about China is that after the revolution in 1949, China chose not to play a major role in world affairs. For decades, China's footprint in the world was very small. It did relatively little training, had relatively little outreach. I'm not suggesting it had no outreach. For example, in my neck of the woods in Africa, the Chinese competed with Taiwan in order to win favor with the socialist countries like Tanzania and so forth. And for example, the Chinese did outreach, which echoes what they're doing now. In East Africa, in the 1960s, it built the Tam-Zam Railroad, which went from Zambia to the coast to help shipping from the central part of Africa out there. And then Chinese got involved in Ethiopia after the revolution in the 1970s and on and on. So I'm not saying they weren't involved anywhere, but their idea was to mainly attend to the domestic sphere, to build their own economy, their own military, their own capacity. And as they built this capacity, they expanded more and more. So if I could jump, let's say in the last 15 years, give or take a few years, China all of a sudden has become a major actor in world affairs. And part of this has to do with the developments inside of China, right? And part of it has to do with the ideology of the Chinese as to the kind of role they want to play in the world in the future. And finally, to put a little asterisk to it, part of the China being able to move into vacuums of various kinds in the world has also been related to the fact of the US in recent years retreating from world affairs. So there's an opening for China to have an influence. And if you are any country in the world that is not very developed, that is having problems, and you look at China and you say to yourself, can we do this as well? It helps to look at China and maybe get the advice from China and maybe get the investments from China because they seem to be successful at home, while the US foreign aid policy has by and large not been a booming success. Right? The other opening that China got for itself, besides a sort of withdrawal from of the US, especially now under the current administration, is the fact that as China expanded economically domestically, it obviously also was interested in trade, right? And the development of trade. And what did it have to offer? It had a lot to offer. It had the very things to offer which many of the developing countries in the world wanted or needed. Help with technology, help with building infrastructure. There's no country in the world which has built as much infrastructure as rapidly as the Chinese have, right? They covered an entire province in China with highways within a year, right? They built one airport after another, one subway after another. Now, first of all, they were able to do it. Second of all, they put all their resources into it. Third, they had the population to do it. And if you want, enslavement of the population to work hard and in fact do it. But they could do it. So if you were another country in the world, South Asia, Southeast Asia, you say to yourself, My God, I've just visited Shanghai or Beijing. Look at what they were able to do. These guys could really help us. So the combination of China becoming self-confident, achieving a lot at home, there being lots of need in the world, and China deciding now we're ready to outreach, all coincided to some extent in the last decade to such a situation where the Chinese have now become, one could arguably say, a dominant actor in world affairs, and if anything, more influential than the United States. Now, this assumption, of course, on the part of the United States was, well, this is certainly during part of the Bush administration, to some extent Obama administration, was to say, well, you know, the Chinese are an authoritarian country, but as they get more affluent, as they get richer, they will become more democratic. Nothing of the sort has happened. And as, you know, some experts have pointed out, what you really have in China is Leninist capitalism. Authoritarian governments, which at the same time is capitalist. Now, it's true that China originally, all its economic growth and capitalism, supposedly, was government run. But as any of you know from watching Rachel or, you know, looking at the news, is that increasingly there is equivalent to mostly private enterprise in China. All the tech companies and so forth they may be supervised by the government can, you know, run riots on them if they want to, but basically they operate like private companies. And millionaires and billionaires and all the rest of it. And what hasn't happened, just to repeat, is that the Chinese have become a nice liberal democracy, which has two effects. One is it makes the Western democratic societies very leery because our role model of bringing liberty and democracy and human rights and all the rest of it to the world seems not to have worked in China. Economic affluence doesn't seem to have brought greater political freedom in particular. And so what is wrong with this picture? Well, decades of books can be thrown in the garbage, all predicted that this would all lead to liberalization, democratization, and all the rest, and it's done nothing of the sort. Now, this has had an impact on China's role in the world, but let me step back in a minute. It also helps all these other countries, which in one way or another are authoritarian, saying, actually, we can probably develop and get help from China without having to become democratic, right? So you now have massive numbers of countries of 200, maybe in excess of 100, having no pretensions of being very democratic. They have authoritarian leaders. They might occasionally have elections, but the people that get elected are still authoritarian leaders. And every now and then somebody gets sick of that. That is to say, democratically elected people become authoritarian. You saw that this last few days in Bolivia, where they just throw somebody out because they're sick of it. But now that's a vacuum, and what's going to fill the vacuum? This is not an easy or secure question. So all these countries in Southeast Asia, some countries in Africa, some countries in Latin America are saying to themselves, okay, the Chinese model, adjusted for our national history and ethos of not having to be a liberal democratic society, can work fine. It's working in China, it can work here. Now, whether it can work in the long run is a separate question. The one thing we've all read about is, you know, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, right? Where the Chinese are now running around all the countries between China, moving all along the original Silk Route, going right into Europe, Hungary, Italy, and so forth, building roads, building railroads, and so forth, and connecting China to the world. Right? Now, while we've read about that, and while that has made a major impact, and I'll talk about the downside for a minute, it's actually not the only Chinese road that's being built. Because simultaneously, for building these infrastructures from China into all the way along the line to Europe, the Chinese have also developed a sea route, which goes through all the oceans and all the ports, which is connecting China with Europe, with Africa, with Latin America, everywhere, right? And so, unbeknownst to most of us English American readers, where we keep seeing what the role is of building all this infrastructure between China and Europe along the Silk Road, what we tend to neglect is the fact that the Chinese are busy doing all this development that's along the sea and sea trading and ports and getting to everywhere. And China is knee-deep in terms of trade and influence, not just in Asia, but in Africa and Latin America as well. They're all over the place, investing happily in those countries, and those countries are happy to have the Chinese investment. However, and in addition, there is what I would call the digital road and belt, which is the Chinese are, and that's largely not been covered in the US press. The Chinese are very busy saying to themselves, it's not just the physical infrastructure and the capacity to get around the seas for trade, but also we need to give them the capacity to deal with modern technology. And what the Chinese have been very busy doing in the last 5 years is to build a science infrastructure along the Road and Belt Initiative. They have the Chinese Academy of Sciences has built science infrastructure in all those countries, research labs, development of training of scientists in China and elsewhere. And why have they done that? Because unlike the West, in general, Europe and the United States, mostly, they recognize that those countries have no particular science and tech capacity very often that is useful for modern and postmodern societies. And in addition, the building of the infrastructure along the Belt and Road requires some local knowledge. For example, knowledge of soil, knowledge of climate, knowledge of all kinds of things that are required to do what? To build effective and workable roads, railroads, infrastructure, right? And rather than to do it all from central China, they've decided, okay, let's also build a network of science and technology along these routes, right? To give those countries the capacity to link with ours, but to also feel that they have some autonomy and some independence with which to address the needs and the issues. Oddly enough, the Chinese learned this in part years ago, again going back to the 1960s when they built the Tamzam Railroad in Africa, because the Chinese at that time just brought in massive numbers of Chinese laborers. They built the railroad, they trained a few people to run them, and then they left. And the whole thing fell apart, right? And the Chinese are very keen not to have their investments fall apart, right? To actually have local people who can operate things, who can do the local research, and so forth. So what I guess I am saying is that rather than the focus entirely on the economic road and belt that goes through Europe, we should focus on two other belts, so to speak, running from China. One is the sea one, and the other one is the technological one and the building of science infrastructure. For those of us, myself I suppose included, who for a long time have tried to look at the role that science and science aid plays, in giving countries capacity in doing proper kind of research. This is actually a very interesting development. Just a little historical perspective here. The World Bank recognized the need to do local science years ago in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And they, along with the Rockefeller Foundation, built institutes to study local grains, for example. There's a rice institute in the Philippines, a wheat institute in Mexico, a tropical food institute in Ibadan, Nigeria. Because the idea was that you needed to have local knowledge in terms of improving food supply and linking it with environmental issues. That led the Canadians and some of the Scandinavians to say, well, we should do that too, more long-term assistance in science and technology in those countries, and they did it on a small scale. When it became an issue in the United States and Congress had to pass a bill to give the US Development Agency the capacity to do long-range 10-year development in science and technology somewhere, Congress wouldn't go along with it, and we never bothered doing it. So our idea was we do it here and we import it. The Chinese learned from their own experience and the experience of World Bank and so forth that you should do it. You're much better off giving local capacity, doing local training, and then having. Does that mean that the Chinese will lose control? No, it doesn't, because the Chinese are still funding it. They're still largely, making sure that the scientists and tech people come to China to trade. So China is all over the place, right? We know that they're all over the place. And from an American perspective, this is alarming. Well, it's alarming in the sense that we started a little trade war. It's not so little. And history will tell us that you never win trade wars. But we haven't learned that, right? So we're having a trade war. The trade war is inconvenient to China, is more than inconvenient to the United States, will have absolutely no good outcome, is a disaster all around. But boy, you're going to tell the Chinese off and put them in their place. Well, the Chinese aren't going to be put off, and they're not particularly put in their place. But let me flip that over. Are the Chinese innocent here? No, they're not innocent. The Chinese have done all kinds of things which are in their self-interest and not in the interest of other people. They've stolen technology. They've violated patents, they've done all kinds of things. But what's the answer to that sort of behavior? The answer to that sort of behavior is serious negotiations with some kind of leverage. Right? It is not to start a trade war, and it is not to tell a rising power that it's being criticized by what? The U.S., a declining power. So the Chinese are essentially playing a waiting game. The trade war hurts the Chinese. It's absolutely true. Right? And so they're willing to give here and there. But at the end of the day, the trade war will hurt us more than the Chinese. And at the end of the day, power is not just based on economics. It's based on military might. It's played on role model might. So let's talk about the role model aspect for a minute. We came out of the Second World War as the much admired country bringing not only a role model of how economic development can take place and how society can become affluent, but also, of course, in terms of liberal democracy and all the rest. The world always recognized that we were more flawed than we let on. I mean, people know about slavery, they know about race discrimination, they know about all kinds of failures on the part of the US. But still, we had a very big international footprint on behalf of basically good values. We may not have always given everybody human rights, but at least we were in favor of them. We might not have We might not have had ideal environmental policy, but at least we supported, and then of course we didn't sign the law of the sea and other environmental treaties. So people were giving us some grace in terms of the partial hypocrisy of our positions, because on balance we were still a role model. And on balance, we were a more important role model than, let's say, some Scandinavian country, because we were a major power, and we could move things in ways that small, minor countries neither were able to nor even had the inclination to. So, in that sense, our role model role kind of gave us all the impression that forever onward, we were a big country, the most successful economic country, and clearly the most influential country in the world. Well, in 2019, that no longer seems to be the case. And there is a vacuum, therefore. That is to say, on the one hand, certainly under the current administration, we've given up the idea that we were, the leading country, helping other countries have reasonable politics, social environment, and all the rest, because now we're doing America first, and the hell with other countries. And the other thing is, we are now, in the last few years, supporting one autocrat after another. So we're hardly in a position to preach to the Chinese that they should become more democratic when we're supporting Orban in Hungary and every imaginable dictator everywhere else. Putin, perhaps, not so bad, right? We're not in favor of corruption, only we seem to be quite corrupt ourselves. So it's gotten murky. And into that vacuum happens to step China, who makes no pretense that they're a liberal democratic society, right? And who we believe any day will collapse because of the authoritarian nature of their society. Now, it doesn't look like any day China is going to collapse, not just because it's a potent, large country, potent force with international entanglements everywhere now, but everywhere is somewhat dependent on China now. And again, it is not just South Asian and Southeast Asian countries running to Europe. It is any number of Latin American countries, insofar as they have investments from overseas and one kind of support, be it technological or financial. It's everywhere. They are everywhere. Right? And they're challenging us everywhere at a very time that we're withdrawing. So are the Chinese not only in the driver's seat, but are there sort of downsides to what the Chinese are doing? Could they get themselves into trouble of one kind or another? Yes. And their weak links are that a lot of their involvement around the world is not particularly their political model, but their technological and economic capacity, right? And that capacity is generated for other countries, mostly in terms of loans, not in terms of donations. So country after country is getting heavily indebted to the Chinese. In a way, they can't repay their loans. Their economies are not powerful enough, not progressive enough, not for either political or economic reasons, earning enough to repay their loans. And I would say the fly in the ointment of all of this is what happens when large numbers of countries are defaulting on their loans to China. What is China going to do? Are they going to throw up their hands and just drop those countries? Are they going to stop their building projects? Are they going to alienate the populations in those countries? It's an open question. I don't know the answer. But there is a looming crisis of the Chinese loans that is coming in the next decade because they're loaning people money like mad. There is a domestic part to the Chinese loan side. And that has to do with the fact that one of the things that the Chinese economy, or kept the Chinese economy going, was that whenever the economy slowed down or when employment slowed down, the Chinese just simply built more infrastructure. They just put people to work. One of the reasons that everything is built out and they can, I don't know, on King Street, it takes them 6 weeks to figure out some blocks, something or other. We all have to circumvent. In China, they fix a whole street overnight, right? Because they have the manpower to do that. But having the manpower means that they have to employ the manpower. And up until now, what they've done is to, whenever ever need arose, they find new projects in China to build, to employ people. Well, I don't know, Beijing, has 7 airports or something like that. I'm exaggerating, but it's got a lot of airports. Well, it doesn't need an 8th and a 9th, even in China. So now what do you do with your population? Well, part of what you do with your population is you send them to all these countries to help the projects. But that has the downside to it, which is that the locals don't like to have armies of Chinese in their societies, because the Chinese aren't actually popular overseas. Nobody particularly likes the Chinese. Why don't they like the Chinese? Dale would say, but they're lovely people. Why don't people like the Chinese? They don't like the Chinese because the Chinese don't like these other people. The Chinese know that they are the dominant historical civilization of the world. They have the best of everything. They are superior cultures and all the rest of it. And they look at Latin Americans and Africans and Southeast Asians as inferior people to some extent. And furthermore, they don't like their own people to mix up with local people. So they build their enclaves, their Chinese, I've mentioned this before, but it's appropriate here to emphasize it. They build enclaves where their Chinese personnel who comes from China to help structure a project or work on it. And they grow their own food and they keep their own, they raise their own pigs and chickens and whatnot. They don't buy the local produce, and they tell their local employees not to mess around with the local population. Don't you dare date anybody or anything of that sort. So, in point of fact, the Chinese are sort of an occupation that is not particularly liked. And actually, the Chinese know this, which is why they send fewer and fewer Chinese onto these projects and now try to hire local labor. But that doesn't change the dynamic of what happens in Malaysia, in Vietnam, in whatever, Sri Lanka, Bolivia, when the countries get terribly indebted, okay, and can't repay their loans. I have no answer as to what the politics of that will be in different countries. On the other hand, once the Chinese have their feet and hands into a society and made some loans, let's take Bolivia, which is a fairly poor and obscure country for most of us. So they give Bolivia some loans. But then you have a trade war with the United States. And the trade war means that all of a sudden you have to pay huge amounts of money, or you can't even, if you pay a huge amount of money, can't get the soybeans that you need from the American farmers, right? Because they can't sell them to China anymore. So you need alternative sources for soybeans. So you tell the Bolivians to mow down their tropical rainforests and grow soybeans. Ditto with Brazil, right? And even if there would be governments, which they happen not to be, but would be governments in Bolivia and Brazil would say, not so fast, there are environmental reasons we don't want to cut down our tropical rainforest. The Chinese will say, well, if you don't do this, and if you don't grow soybeans so we can buy them for it, we'll reconsider these loans. We may not help you build the airport or the road or whatever, right? So they have leverage once they have the sort of loan relationship with countries and can get countries to reconfigure their own economies to suit the Chinese to find substitutes for the American products which they can no longer get or don't want to get. Then there's technology. Getting back to technology for a minute. Our view of the Chinese has been they steal our technology, but they're dependent on our technology. Well, in point of fact, there are some technologies where the Chinese are way ahead of ours. Artificial intelligence, the G5 network, they're way ahead, and they're going to conquer the world in those areas. We don't really believe that. We aren't ready to do that. We still think, to believe, not to do it, but to believe that this is going to happen seriously, or what the impact of it will be. And the Chinese now have a huge science establishment, which isn't entirely dependent on stealing things from the US or anybody else. And you can see that the Chinese, in areas where they are ahead of things, are in fact in very good relationships with other industrial countries like European countries who are considering the 5G network. We tell them they shouldn't, or they can't, or will be mad, or something, but they're going to do it anyway. So the Chinese, quite on their own, have now developed science and technology, not in every area, but in some areas, which puts them onto the world market as not just a competitor to the US, but in some cases ahead of the US. Right? So here we have a situation of a major trading country, a major seafaring country, a major technological country, a major loan country. When you can't get loans from the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or UN, you might be able to get them from the Chinese. They're playing a very dominant role in the world, in the lives of many countries. It isn't felt by us so much, right? Because, our connection with China is largely, eating Chinese food or something. But it's not that we somehow think that we're dependent or interdependent, right? We think of ourselves as being ahead. So imagine yourself some random other country in a world in which the US is insulting everybody, is withdrawing from the world in many ways, is arrogant in many ways, still has the largest military, but increasingly the Chinese also have a large navy and military. And the Chinese have things to offer that we don't have to offer in terms of loans, in terms of technology, in terms of their willingness to help other countries in ways that we're not. That buys you influence. To what end, of course, remains an open question, because influence to do what? That's not clear how this is going to play out in the next decade, but certainly influence of one kind or another. So I guess one of my arguments is, it's obvious, I've been repeating it, is that on the one hand, China is rising, but quite independently of China, the US role in the world is diminishing, which leaves even a bigger opening for China. What about other countries out there? Well, Japan is Japan. Once upon a time, we thought Japan was going to take over the world, but it clearly hasn't. The Southeast Asian countries, some of them, like Vietnam, are doing reasonably well, are quite potent, might, play a role. But in the contemporary world of high-stakes technology and very high-stakes military, that may not get you as far as historically it might. In some centuries past, let's say Vietnam might become a major seafaring country that plays a role. But size at the moment can potentially play a role. But as I said with my Indian example, it doesn't have to. Brazil and India don't play a major role in the world. I'm not saying they play none, but they don't play a major role in the world. Is China afraid of India rising? Well, maybe yes and maybe no. It doesn't look very promising. They have Modi as an authoritarian leader. He is human rights violations right and left against all Muslims. The situation between India and Pakistan could lead to a nuclear conflict. The Chinese would just as soon stay out of that. The Russians, which I'll talk about in January, are kind of all over the place as well, but they don't have the resources. The economy of Russia is the size, roughly speaking, of Spain, so they are not a major economic power in the way that the Chinese are a major economic power. So maybe if Xi goes, and maybe they will get another leader, and maybe the Chinese millennials will decide that the country is going down the wrong road. Very little evidence for that. I mean, I'm not saying that there are not young Chinese folks who would prefer to live in the United States than China, but it is also the case that all the surveys that have been done of the millennials in China used to be they'd like to come to the US or Canada or whatever. Nowadays, in the last 5 years, the answer is we would like to study overseas, but we actually want to live in China. That is to say, they're willing, at the margins at least, to put up with the political system. And the other thing about the Chinese is that they're really quite flexible. That is to say, yes, they're very ideological. On the other hand, when something isn't working, they try something else. They are not as yet rigidified in the way that old industrial countries tend to be rigidified. So there's a lot of room for maneuver of, working things out, perhaps liberalizing some things while tightening things somewhere else. And in an interesting way, when you say, to what extent can a country's international outreach be diminished by domestic problems, the Chinese seem to be fairly mindful of it. For example, in, let's say, 25 years ago, the Chinese population over 65 was like 12%. It's now 25%. China is a rapidly aging society, just the way industrial Europe and the US, less so because of immigration, is a rapidly aging society. And you say to yourself, well, that's a problem. They're going to have a shortage of labor. And will they have to import labor from somewhere else? Perhaps, maybe not in your or my lifetime, but maybe 10 years down the road. Many of us hope to live at least another 10 years, right? So that might happen. But they're also mindful of social issues. For example, this has nothing to do with foreign affairs. Because they have an aging population and because they have an urbanizing population, the social mores of China, which is that children take care of their aged parents, is going away because people move to urban areas, they're living in smaller apartments, they can't look after their parents, right? So what do you do with an aging population? What the Chinese have done experimentally in the last year or two is to build large villages in certain areas for old folks, and they target unemployed Chinese or underemployed Chinese to work in them, so as to reduce that social problem. A, the pressure on the young people, which would alienate them from government policy, and B, to do something about a rising social issue. Yeah, we're going to face a huge issue of a huge aging population. Let's do something now, quickly, before it goes out of hand. And so they're addressing the problem in a way that we're refusing to address it, or other industrial countries, by and large, don't address it. So in some ways, you can see that the Chinese, on the one hand, are rigidly authoritarian, and on the other hand, are fairly flexible in terms of adjusting some domestic aspects as well as international aspects of their policies. And that gives them a lot of license internationally, right, to go roaming around to try to do things. Now, lastly, I want to talk about the military side, because one of the aspects, of course, of the US. We're the most potent military power in the world. And as the Chinese are building up militarily, isn't this scary, and shouldn't we do something about it? Well, it's scary, but what to do about it? One of the things the Chinese are doing is rapidly, as you've no doubt read, is creating islands where they don't exist for naval bases, but they're also purchasing islands. They are purchasing some Pacific islands from poor islanders who are ready not just for a loan, but for tons of money to survive as small islands out there in the Pacific, and saying, why don't we just sell one of our islands to the Chinese? And they're doing that. So the Chinese are busy in the Pacific gobbling up little territories everywhere to use as military bases. Now, there's a counterexample to this, and you say, oh, this is sort of crazy. It's, 22nd century movie stuff. Because a lot of those islands will be sinking, and therefore they won't exist anywhere. Anyway, so what are they buying? They're buying an island which in the next decade or whatever will sink because of global warming. Actually, the Chinese are saying to themselves, well, the Dutch and other people do something about rising seas. We have the resources to do something if the seas rise here to protect a naval base or a airfield or something of that sort. So the Chinese are beginning to do outreach militarily, which makes the United States and the Russians in particular very nervous, which leads to another question. What happens, or what would happen, if the Russians and the Chinese link up again? Because that used to be a big American fear, and theoretically, that would be a good idea for the Russians. It's a less good idea for the Chinese. And so I think that has a kind of a problem attached to it. Then what could be another fly in the ointment or make things better or worse? And that is, in fact, climate change. Because, first of all, the Chinese don't have enough water for their current population, right? The Chinese population has to deal with a limited supply of water, not just for human use, but also for agriculture. Because if you sometime look at a map of China, not a political map, but a geographic map, you can see that actually the population centers of China, as well as the fertile parts of China, are a fairly small chunk of the Chinese country as a whole. A lot of parts of China are mountainous, uninhabitable, can grow things, and so forth. So the Chinese are confronting serious historical as well as contemporary issues having to do with climate that they inherited, as well as climate change. Well, what do you do about it? Well, contrary to what we read in most of our press, they're actually doing a lot. Not fast enough, because if you are a country as large as China and your population is entirely dependent on coal, you can't switch like that to get into less polluting energy sources. So they're doing a lot, but they're still polluting a lot. And they know it. But it should be said that they're aware of it, and they're trying to move as quickly as possible. Instead of helping them move as quickly as possible, the disposition, of course, of the US is, never mind, we're not interested in any of that. Because actually the US could help quite a bit if it had a more positive relationship with China. But in any event, the environmental issue for the Chinese is huge. And of course, that makes the fact that you have a slowdown of the population really important. China, like most industrial countries, have a population replacement of less than 2, right? We've talked about fertility and so forth before. So they're not only not replacing themselves, they're shrinking as a population, while India is still growing, right? The average Indian per capita fertile a woman has, depending on whose statistics you look at, 6 births or whatever. In China, it's 1.6 or something, 1.8. So the Chinese are mindful of it, but are they acting fast enough to rescue themselves domestically in terms of their economy? And to what extent will it impact on foreign affairs is not clear. I just, no, I don't know the answer. I don't know that anybody knows the answer. You can either fearmonger and say, oh, they'll take care of it, they'll just pollute the world, they don't care, or you can say they're trying their best to care, and quickly so. And, we've been reading for a long time about the level of pollution in Beijing, where, you can't see and you can't breathe. But on the other hand, you might have noticed recently, we've been reading about New Delhi, where the pollution is far greater than anything in China right now. So, they're working on it, but are they working on it quick enough? And while they're working on it, there is a foreign policy component. Being aware of the problems of the environment, being aware of the limitations of arable land, and so forth. One of the outreaches, of course, to the rest of the world, be it Latin America or Africa, is in fact to say, help us with this. Grow soya beans, other products that we need. And they don't much care whether Brazil is doing its own environment in. What the Chinese want from Brazil is agricultural products like soybeans. So they're kind of ruthless. They're not saying, let's all in the universe do environmentally sound things. They're saying, hey guys, we need soybeans. We don't care how you produce them, but if you produce them, we'll buy them because we can't deal with the Americans anymore, on this particular issue. So in fact, the environmental damage that China is doing, it's not just what it's doing domestically or incapable of addressing domestically fast enough, but the environmental damage the Chinese are doing all over the world, where they have investments, where they've given loans, where other governments are increasingly dependent on them in one way or another. Does that make sense? In some fashion? So the outreach is so last but not least, there are many other things to cover actually, is the fact, of course, that the US is essentially butting out in Asia, right? It's not even necessarily sending American representative to ASEAN. It's nixed the agreement, Trans-Pacific Agreement, all the kinds of things which would bolster other Asian countries to have more leverage on the Chinese. And from the Chinese perspective, this is great. The Chinese can more or less, they have a free-for-all. They can do more or less, if it's harmful to other countries, what the hell? Nobody is going to do anything about it because the Americans are no longer playing a role. They've decided not to play a role. Now, can this be reversed? To some extent, of course it can. You could have an administration coming into power which re-engages the US to some extent and say, hey, we're a player of one kind or another, but you can't ever get back to where you left off. That is to say, by now, the Chinese have had X years of loans, making other countries dependent on them and all the rest. So you can't really put that genie back in the bottle again exactly the way it was. So in that sense, our lack of interest and concerns are undermined. And furthermore, they're undermined in terms of other countries in the area, for example, East Asia. Instead of bargaining, negotiating, mediating, whatever word you want to use, between South Korea and Japan, we just let them feud and make things worse, which is a great opening for China in terms of North Korea and the rest. So our lack of engagement, not just with some things Chinese, but with the rest of Asia and the rest of other parts in the world, gives Chinese pretty much free rein. If the Japanese are super busy and the South Koreans feuding with each other over historical slights and wrongs and all the rest of it, it means neither of those countries are minding the store in terms of some of these islands and the military development of the Chinese. So, where are we? We are in a world where the balance of power has shifted, where it's shifted in a major way to China, where China could still make missteps of one kind or another, domestically and internationally. But at the moment, it looks as if they pretty much have the field to themselves in many countries, and we have essentially stepped out. And there are no other countries or groups who can step in. You can say, well, can Europe fill the vacuum? No, Europe is in a mess itself. It can't fill the vacuum. And what's particularly sad is that nobody is filling, sort of philosophically sad, if not empirically sad, that nobody is filling the vacuum of countries who somehow stand for the values that people fought for in the 20th century. Democracy, more human rights, and all the rest. Because not only are we not have butted out and are no longer a role model, but Europe essentially has butted out. Whether it's over immigration, or whether it's Brexit, or it's neo-Nazism, or it's other things, England in particular was the other country in the world, along with the United States, which even if you didn't like much about them or care much about them, were at least to younger generations role models of democracy and so forth. Well, parliamentary democracy in England isn't going so well right now. And the worst part of it is this is not just a right-wing phenomenon. This in the US and in Europe. It's a right-wing and left-wing phenomenon. Because populists on the right and populists on the left, both in Europe and the United States, are all in favor of withdrawing from the world and often have similar authoritarian tendencies. And so it leaves the middle sort of throwing up their hands and essentially saying, you know, either there is a middle, but the middle isn't speaking up, the middle seems not to dominate. So whether it has to do with U.S., immigration policy and human rights violations along the border, or whether it has to do with neo-Nazi movements in Germany, or whether it has to do with the English Brexit and, the hell with Europe, we're doing our own thing, or whether it's the erosion of NATO because we're not playing ball, or whether it's giving sway to an authoritarian like Putin of one kind or another. It doesn't really matter. The whole atmosphere is one of, if you were sitting in China and you were a smart university student, you would say, there's nothing out there that is really attractive. I don't like a lot of stuff at home, but I might as well put shoulder to the wheel at home. I'm not saying all Chinese feel that way, but I think if you took a poll, that would be the answer. So I've unfortunately used up the hour. If you will forgive me, I will spend maybe the first 10 minutes talking for a minute about the Middle East, and then we'll have discussion. So take a break. So in 1939, the playwright Bertolt Brecht said, "He who laughs has not read the news." He who laughs has not read the news. I am not going to have a detailed Middle East discussion in 10 minutes or 5 minutes. I just want to say that the US withdrawal from the Middle East has fundamentally changed the dynamics in the Middle East forever. There isn't a single Middle East country which is not in a mess, and it's getting worse. And while it is perfectly possible to say that we don't want to be in the middle of lots of countries and have our military there, our absence, not just militarily, but in terms of commitment and so forth, is fundamentally changing a whole region and fundamentally changing any input the U.S. may have on the region. And it's not just the inputs into Syria and Iraq and so forth, it is that it is in the process of unraveling NATO because of Turkey. And even in the case of Israel, which is always at the forefront of the U.S. and which you cannot discuss rationally half the time in the U.S., Israel, as most of you may know, gets the most foreign assistance of any country in the world, military and otherwise. It is mind-boggling how much assistance Israel gets. You can't make a criticism of Israel without being called anti-Semitic. But the fact of the matter is that the dynamic and the role that Israel is playing in the Middle East is also changing, quite aside from the conflict of the last 24 hours, which has ignited, one of the leaders in Hamas was killed. Now the people in Gaza are shooting back and all the rest of it. But what is interesting is that Israel is carefully having relationships with Russia and with Saudi Arabia. And they have recognized that they all need to link and so forth. So that Israel, on the one hand, Israel is so dependent on the United States. On the other hand, Israel is looking for its long-term future in that part of the world and recognizes the U.S. very carefully. It's not public insofar as possible, but it's carefully having relations with Saudi Arabia and the Russians about affairs in the Middle East. So at some point I'll talk in detail about the Middle East, but you should note that there's been a cataclysmic and fundamental shift in the Middle East, the role of the U.S. in the Middle East, and how all of that will unravel over time. So I just thought I'd mention that. To cheer you up. Yes, sir.
Can you talk about Taiwan and Hong Kong?
Can I talk about Taiwan and Hong Kong? Well, the Chinese are playing it cool, as they often do, and careful. They haven't marched into Hong Kong, and if sensible analysis would probably say they'll try not to walk into Hong Kong. And it's hard to know how exactly that's going to unravel in Hong Kong. And the reason is that it would hurt them in Taiwan and other places to move into Hong Kong. So they're playing a careful, involved, but not marching the military in game in Hong Kong. Whether the opposition in Hong Kong can get everything it's looking for, the answer is probably no, but they'll probably get more in the long term because everyone, including the people in Hong Kong who are pro-Chinese, are recognizing it's wrecking the economy in Hong Kong and something needs to be done. It's not helpful that the leader, Ms. Lam, is fairly incompetent. That doesn't help matters either, but hard to say how that is going to play itself out. What does, and that's a very good question on your part, is Taiwan, which theoretically is also supposed to become an autonomous province of China. You better believe that the Taiwanese are not enthusiastic about that prospect, seeing what's happening to Hong Kong. So China could conquer Hong Kong, but that would be a total mess. So it's made the politics of Taiwan different than it was before the Hong Kong situation, that even people who were in Taiwan, who are more likely to want to be more aligned with mainland China for economic and other reasons, are pulling back to some extent. And it's just, in some fundamental way, has made things worse for the Chinese in terms of its claim to allow autonomy to certain provinces. But that's not just Hong Kong and Taiwan, that's also up in Uyghur country, right, imprisoning all those Muslims and the rest. So the Chinese are having problems, and they're serious problems, and they're not getting enough attention because of all the rest of what's going on in the world. But it's certainly, and I have no way to prognosticate any of this, but it's certainly a problem worth watching, because how the Chinese position themselves in terms of Hong Kong and Taiwan will say a lot for how much they will have how much problems they will have in the near abroad, and how in the future they can annex these territories in some fashion. And then, of course, there's North Korea, which is a big problem for China as well. So I'm not saying China is home free in terms of having problems. It's having serious problems in the region. It's just that it's managed to kind of cover them because of all these other actions. It's not a very satisfactory answer, but whatever. Back there, no.
The firewall.
The firewall.
Well, it controls what Chinese people know about the whole rest of the world. So what do you think they're going to keep doing or doing? The Great Chinese Firewall.
Yeah, I know. It's the technology, right? You can't get information. It's hard to get information. It's not quite as one imagines. That is to say, people in China who try still have access one way or the other to a fair amount of information. It's a problem. It's a problem for the politics in China. It's as the millennials have more and more say in the government, the old fogies go away, that might change to some extent. And of course, politically, what the Chinese can say is, well, we have a firewall to stop us from having the kind of mess you are having in the US with Facebook and everything. We're smarter than you guys.
But they blocked the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, all of Google, any Gmail.
Yeah.
Really
It's amazing, though, how much information the Chinese who try still are able to get in spite of it. But the regular public, Mr. and Mrs. China, are not going to read those things anyway. But, the inconvenience of not being able to Google and that stuff is really grating. And the Chinese who want out, who would just as soon live overseas, are the ones who mention that as a dominant reason why they're sick and tired of living in China. By the way, the Chinese, 1 million plus, moving to 2 million Chinese are living overseas in areas, and I've mentioned this before, other than, Canada, the United States, in places like Africa, where they voluntarily moved to, and they're not there at the behest of their governments, but have moved there to start little businesses and stuff. So there is an exodus out of China, but of people who can move and who want to move and who want to be liberated from all of that. But it's not a huge exodus, and in any event, China has a large population. They can lose a few million. They don't care. So some of the people who are sent overseas to work to various countries in the Road and Belt initiatives and things like that, then decide to stay and to move their families. That's also true. And they're sick and tired of the firewall. Yes, sir.
Well, that talks about what you call, and we all agree, I think, is true, which is China is a rigidly authoritarian country. There is no freedom of the press, as we know it, no freedom of religion, really, no freedom of speech. If you don't do it the way the Communist Party decides they're going to do it, you're in jail or you're in trouble.
Yeah, just
the price we pay for having our society, which is as free as it is. We grow up with this freedom and this ability to do our own thing and move where we want to move and not be forced to work in an older folks community so that the older... It's the difference between the command economy, the rigid authoritarianism, and the democracy which we enjoy and the Europeans enjoy and so many other countries enjoy.
Yeah,
To me, that's worth something.
It is worth something.
Totally is we're running things.
Yeah, it is worth something, but let me just give a counter argument. For the average Mr. or Mrs. China, who is not a political elite and who doesn't aspire to it, you actually have a lot of freedom, and increasing freedom. You can move around more easily. You have access to all kinds of things you didn't have access to. You're not particularly like most Mr. and Mrs. America are also, not particularly bothered one way or the other. They're not political. They're not tuned in. So what you describe is absolutely true for anybody who aspires to being a political actor or who tunes into it. But there are gazillions of Chinese, millions of Chinese, who are saying, actually, we have a lot more freedom, we can move around, we can now move around to various cities and get entitlements to live there, much more so when we used to be able to, we can move around jobs more easily, we have choices for our children, their education. So if you would talk to the Chinese equivalent of some random small-town person in Kansas, they would say, well, what you say is true, but it's not really affecting me. And we have, more choice to watch our silly programs on TV than we ever had. We weren't aspiring to watch the BBC. We never watched it before. We're not interested in watching it. We have more freedom of religion. The various Christian religions are now developing. They're under government supervision, but there are more churches. You can go back to have your Confucian meetings on weekends if you want. In fact, the Chinese, so there seems to be more freedom of religion, not if you're Muslim, but Christian versus various Chinese religion. And also, don't forget that it's not like China had democracy, which has been taken away by Mao. China was a deeply centralized and in many ways authoritarian society always. And that is in people's, that history is sort of in people's brains.
And that plays into the communist plan.
It plays into the communist plan, but it also means that the individual knows that ancestors also had limitations, and that maybe they're doing better than their ancestors, and maybe they have more opportunity than ancestors, you see. So it's, on the one hand, what you're saying is totally true, and particularly true in terms of politicized elite. But it is not completely true in terms of the ordinary Chinese who says, our lives are getting better, I have more flexibility, I can travel. If I want to take a cruise up and down the Rhine or the Danube or whatever, you have gazillion millions of Japanese tourists everywhere. They can travel, they can go in the outside world. Much of the middle class benefits from that, and they feel that benefit. So in the quiet of their own home, they may say on the one hand, on the other. But the one hand that makes their lives better is so palatable that it covers a lot, I would say. You don't have to agree with it, but that's my take on it.
I agree with you. I really do. It's how clever the communists have been to
Yeah.
play on the very thing you talk about, the fact that the Chinese have always been subservient.
In part, it's clever, and in part, it's moving in the historical Chinese trajectory. That's what I want to point out. Because it's not like in our country, we're used to, let's say, reasonable politics or semi-reasonable politics, and now we have Trump, right? So we really feel it. But if we've always had Trumps, I don't know where I'm going with this. There was a hand going up. Yes, sir.
In spite of that, unless things have changed, doesn't China have somewhat of a large footprint here in terms of, don't we have a lot of loans and money we owe them? Don't they own a lot of property here?
Yes, don't the Chinese have a large footprint in the United States? Yes, they have a large footprint in the United States, lots of loans, lots of apartment buildings and hotels owned by the Chinese. The Chinese have invested fairly heavily. And that, of course, plays to some extent into Trump's idea of they keep adjusting their currency to our disadvantage. The economics of this are, in some senses, somewhat difficult to understand, because when they devalue the yuan, which, by the way, they've only devalued it by 2%, and the historically moving it up and down by a lot ended some time ago, and we pretend it's still there. But in any event, that makes Chinese goods cheaper to purchase, let's say, in the United States, right? If, on the other hand, they raise the price of their currency, it makes it more expensive for them to sell things because other people will have to pay more, right? So it's a two-way street, and it's not as if we don't adjust the value of our currency. So the Chinese can be considered guilty for having manipulated their currency in the past by quite a lot to help their domestic economies. But more recently, as their interests are more far-flung, they have been fairly careful in making modest adjustments, just like we make modest adjustments. So that's in the sort of Trump world, that's a major problem, right? They disadvantage us and all the rest of it. This whole balance of trade business is, there might be some economists here, in large proportion a sham. It is the fact that we have a negative trade balance with them because we buy a lot more than we sell to them. But you can't just look at that in terms of economic relations, right? Because there are other aspects to it. So we freak out about it, and I think excessively so. And the Chinese, at this point, are a very good sort of, punching bag. Because if there's something wrong and we want to defend our trade war, it's because of the Chinese, right? Some of it has to do with our own economics, our own economic setup. It has to do with the fact that if you just take one economic factor, it doesn't explain the total economic relationship. For example, investments coming in and all the rest of it. So it's complex. And I'm not giving the Chinese a pass on this. I'm just railing against the misinformation that we all eat up by listening to our politicians, because some of it simply does not make sense if you look at it as a total picture as compared to one item that people tend to look at. Yes, sir?
It would seem like the existential threat for the next period that we're going to live in is the climate. Climate is an acute crisis, and the challenge is to get off of fossil fuels. And one country can't do it by itself.
Right.
It will take a worldwide effort. Can China lead it?
I don't think China can lead it. Oh, I'm sorry. Climate is the existential threat. It takes everybody. Can China lead? Since we've butted out, right, there is no environmental issues. It's all made up. You might have noticed recently, or yesterday, day before, that the Environment Protection Agency can avoid looking at scientific reports. We don't even have to pay attention to the scientists anymore in our agencies and so forth. So, can China lead? China probably can't lead because it can't turn its economy around quickly enough, its society around quickly enough to purify itself in a great big hurry. China can lead politically by participating and putting its oar, and in some senses being more mindful of not saying to the Brazilians, give us soybeans, but don't cut down your tropical rainforest. So the ruthlessness with which China is pursuing undermining environment around the world, never mind in China, is counter to the Chinese being able to say we're doing everything in our power. In some ways, at home, that is true, but it's not true in terms of its role in the world. So I don't anticipate, some kind of purity on the part of China sort of leading the universe on the environment. The U.S. was well placed to do it, but we've given up on that. And as you all know, because you read, even the Sentinel, God knows, covers it, is that we have a window of 1 or 2 years to stop the percentage of temperature increase, which fundamentally will run havoc, right? And nobody's doing anything. So how we're going to deal with all of that is beyond me. Yes?
Yes. What's your evaluation of Xi? I mean, there's sort of a great man theory of history. Look at Putin's long tenure. Trump has only been at it, he's really the end of the middle point of certain courses. How important is Xi to what China is doing now and into the future?
Well, how important is Xi to what China is doing? So the first thing for me to say is that I'm not particularly competent to make an evaluation of Xi and his domestic politics. The second thing is, of course, I'm tempted to do so. And, as far as I can tell, he has pretty good control over things over there. But his political control and masterminding things does not mean that he is entirely surrounded by yes people. Because while they may be yes people politically, in terms of keeping central control, that everybody surrounding him, as far as I can tell, is in favor of. But a lot of the people are technical experts of one kind or another. And those technical experts have input into it. So I don't think there's anybody around him that's undermining his authoritarian tendencies. But I think there are a lot of people who are quite forward-looking in terms of various economic, foreign policies, and those kinds of things. But, that question really should be asked by somebody who is a domestic China expert, which I am not, so I'm skating on thin ice here. Yes?
Don't underestimate the hearts and minds of some of the Chinese. A memorable experience I had in China. I walked into a bank with a jar of pennies that I meant to dispense as gifts for the kids. And the bank was empty. There wasn't a soul to be seen. Someone came to the counter. When I mentioned the pennies had Abraham Lincoln on it, they came pouring out of the woodwork. Every office person came to get that memento, Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
So it may be deep in their spirits.
Okay. Did you all hear that? She came with a whole jar of pennies, American pennies, with Abraham Lincoln on them. And she was in the bank, and everybody came up to her and wanted to look at the pennies and maybe have a penny and so forth. So Abraham Lincoln is a concept. I want to say something that's not responsive to what you're saying, but in a way is one of the things that I think many of you have traveled, some of you have traveled a lot. It's a lot easier to read about countries, even if you stepped into the country as a tourist, because you take a greater interest somehow. And one of the good things about affluent Americans is that they also are traveling, and they're traveling to China and other places, which doesn't make you into a China expert. But, for example, I take myself as an example. I've been to maybe 100 countries of the 200 in the world, or slightly more. I'm not an expert on all of those countries, but I read about them very differently once I've stepped into it. And then you get much more of a feel because you're more interested about these sorts of issues. Yes, of course there's nuances. Yes, of course there are many Chinese who are not hostile to the U.S. at all. There's no reason to think that Chinese would be or should be hostile. Chinese might be hostile to Trump's trade war, but then lots of people in the U.S. are hostile, lots of people in the world. It's stupid, it's idiotic, it makes no sense politically, never mind economically in the end, right? But, so yes, many Chinese have warm feelings about lots of places in the world. As I said, they take trips up the Danube and they, whatever. They're all over the place as tourists. I understand, I've read somewhere that menus in Berlin now have Chinese on them because they have so many tourists and so forth. So the Chinese, having opened up in a sense to other parts of the world, also has an impact. And if, for example, tomorrow the Chinese government would say, you Chinese middle-class people can't travel anymore, this would be very stupid politically. So things change on the basis of interaction and openness. That does not mean that China is about to become a democracy. Yes?
Where is it you do your reading about China?
Well, it starts with the New York Times, the London Economist, the Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, BBC, occasionally books that are written about those countries. If something is important or interesting, I read the reviews of books, and I identify a book which is seems particularly useful, and that helps inform me. But I'm sort of instead of having lots of talents and playing lots of sports or whatever, I read a lot, which is what I do. I do swim, just in my defense, and that's where I put lectures together.
How do you see our national debt playing a role over the next few years?
Well, I think there are two ways I want to answer that. First, national debt is not inherently a bad thing. Countries can carry debt. Excessive national debt can become a very bad thing economically. And the national debt, most of the time in the last 20 years, was manageable in one way or another. The national debt potentially could become unmanageable because we are, in fact, increasing, even under Trump, our national debt hugely. And if Elizabeth Warren were to become president, which I somehow doubt, but anyway, and she would put into her plan, her Medicare plan, we would be hugely in debt. And at a certain point, again, I'm not an economist, at a certain point, you say the debt is too great to bear, while being in debt is in itself not a bad thing. Just think about it for a moment in terms of our domestic things. We don't consider getting a mortgage for a house as a bad debt, because it allows us to live well, to live in the place we want to live, and we can imagine repaying it. If, on the other hand, we decided to move out of whatever houses we bought for $250,000 50 years ago and want to buy a multi-million-dollar house, which would eat up our entire income or pensions or whatever, you would say this is not a good debt. So some debt is actually not bad. Excessive debt can be a nightmare, and we're quickly moving under Trump in the direction of excessive debt. Because just take something that relates to what we talked about today. So the soybean farmers can't sell their soybeans to the Chinese anymore, right? So Trump says, well, these are part of my electorates, so we're going to pay the soybean farmers. Well, paying the soybean farmers adds to the national debt in a way that's unnecessary or could have been unnecessary. So as you pile up this kind of stuff, as you pile up a huge military spending, right, of one kind or another, without any kind of compensatory income, that can go out of control. So debt is potentially a worry, but all debt and all national debt inherently is not a bad thing. Does that make sense? Yes. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'd like to add that debt, the idea of bad debt, is only commensurate with paying it back. If you can't pay it back, if the country can't pay it back, it's bad debt.
Yes, and it's whether you can pay it back not only has to do with the health of your economy, it also has to do with things like the value of your currency, right? Because it may very well be the case that you got yourself indebted, but paying back the debt is actually fairly cheap, right? Does that make sense? So it's a complicated thing. And at which point you reach the point where debt becomes non-sustainable, because it then means you can't do any of the things you need to do. For example, you say, well, we can afford, let's say, a new line of airplanes, military airplanes, but we certainly can't afford to repair the tunnels and the bridges, right? Eventually, the collapse of the tunnels and bridges, quite aside from people dying, means the economic activity dies in those places. There was an article, I raised the tunnel thing because there was an article in the New York Times the other day that most American tunnels are at risk of collapsing. Well, just imagine what will happen when that happens, right? So what the consequences are by in getting yourself indebted and then claiming you can't get indebted for socially important things becomes problematic, quite aside from the actual numbers attached to it. So it's a trade-off as well. Yes?
So there's been a prediction that at some point the U.S. will cease to be the #1 economy and China will be. And somebody out there, a former New York Times correspondent, wrote a book saying that that will cause a direct conflict between the U.S. and China militarily. Does that make any sense to you, or do you have different opinions?
So China's economy is going to become larger than that of the U.S. They are going to be more successful. The U.S. will be in retreat. The prognostication is that maybe that will lead to conflict and war. It could. And the problem here is how graceful is a declining country willing to be in its decline as compared to reaching out. In general, history tells us that countries in decline usually aren't very graceful about their decline. That's true of colonial empires and so forth. And that leads to the domestic politics of countries. Because if we are in decline, if somebody else has become a major power, also economically, politically, it's very easy to then mobilize the population to say, well, let's, bop them over the head. Let's have a war here, because that's the only way to rectify the situation. By the way, it usually does not rectify the situation. But it does lead to bad domestic politics, and we already have domestic politics. Others are doing us in. We need to disengage from others. We don't need to look inside as improving our situation, right? Our small towns are dying. Is somebody out there like Trump going to fix it? Well, aside from Trump not being able to fix it, one of the things that would stop small towns from dying is if immigrants would actually move in, because they're the ones that bring the economy back to life. In fact, we have a shortage of labor right now in many areas because of the shortfall of immigration in the last couple of years, right? But is that what Mr. and Mrs. Voda by and large believe? No, they believe the immigrants are dragging our economy. And it's very difficult to convince anybody that the immigrants not only aren't a drag on the economy, they're absolutely essential. And by the way, the fact that all European countries are in decline in terms of their population, because people like Italians, Spaniards, it's not only that they don't have a fertility rate of 2 per couple, they have a fertility rate of 1.2, right? And their domestic populations are shrinking. So they actually need labor coming in from the outside, as does Japan, as does South Korea, right? So the fact that people will have to move around from countries and places that are overpopulation then gets to be very threatening, because these people don't look like us. Right? And then we build a whole thing upon this. They not only look like us, but like our immigrant ancestors who came from God knows, Russia, Ireland, Italy, wherever. Those guys, they integrated into American polity. They learned English quickly and they became part of us. But these guys don't do that. Well, as a matter of fact, any study will show that Hispanics, first generation, learned English even more rapidly than first generation Italians and Russians did. It just simply isn't true. Studies have been done about this. But even people who are left of center believe that. God knows, I said this before, you go to Watsonville and they always speak Chinese. They don't even bother learning English. No, Watsonville is full of newly arrived Hispanic speakers, and their kids have moved out. That's why they always speak Spanish, because they're new arrivals who integrate into the thing. So a lot of this is proven untruth, but we've come to believe it. And then when people have to move around, the racism comes in. And that's not just American racism, that's also Chinese racism. China likes the idea of everybody being Chinese. They don't like the idea of people coming in from India and Africa and other places. And in many Asian countries, it's very difficult to become a national in that country, right? I can't become Chinese. I can live in China for the rest of my life. I won't become a Chinese. I can't become a Japanese because of the way I look, right? In this country, that has not been the case up until now. But now we feel threatened because those of us who are white people are going to be the minority. And so we feel threatened. And that manifests itself in the politics. And it's very destructive, and it's very bad. And yes, it could lead to conflict. Because one of the things that people do, if they feel threatened, is decide, well, if you can have a little war, but that erodes your power even more, right? It's a losing proposition. So do I imagine there'll be wars and conflicts in the future? Yes, in the Middle East, possibly with the Far East and so forth. It's not going to be pleasant.
So given the convoluted complexities and troublesome dynamics of the world affairs, China rising and climate change, who amongst the current candidates has the better understanding?
Yes, who amongst the candidates has a better understanding about the complexity of this world? I'm not going to get into that. But I'll tell you some of my prejudices. My prejudice is that people in their late 70s ought not to become president. I don't care whether they're liberal or conservative or socialists or non-socialists. Just think of, for those of you who are above 70, just think of how little energy or less energy you have than you had when you were in the 50s and 60s. And for those of you who've moved into the 80s, just think of how your brain doesn't work as well anymore as it did in their 70s. I use myself as an illustration. It is not promising. I would not like the idea of having to work 7 days a week, 16 hours, and be coherent. It is ridiculous. It is furthermore ridiculous that in a fairly young society, you can't find people who have experience, who are in their 50s and 60s, to run a country. It is foolhardy to believe that if you have very little experience and just because you can raise a lot of money, you should become president. And I think basically it is a nightmare of who's out there and who is not out there in terms of who's running for president. At the end of the day, it's, I suppose, the lesser of the evils. For those of us who are not Trump fans, and there may be some out here who are, it is anybody but Trump. But anybody but Trump is not necessarily a person, going back to your question, who will be able to recoup some of what we've lost, to engage on the climate issue, and lead the world in some sense. So, yes, I've read the news, and so I am not laughing. To go back to the break. Yes, it does. It does. It does. Yes. And amongst all of them who are running, I'm not about to say who at the end of the day I would prefer, but plague on all your houses. So on that happy note, I know if there's an urgent question, otherwise I will liberate you and wish you happy holidays. We might as well at least have a nice family and whatnot, live life the best we can, and see some of you in January.